There wasn't a film to come out in 2022 deemed more contentious and problematic than Andrew Dominik's Blonde. Not only was it the Australian director's return to film, being his first film in 10 years since 2012's Killing Him Softly, but it stars one of the biggest up-and-coming actresses in Hollywood today. Amidst the Ana de Armas Oscar nomination, the film has become more and more polarizing, and the reception has become more and more mixed. Blonde, to me, while understandably a very problematic film in parts, seems to also be a very multi-layered and complex film. Andrew Dominik presents Blonde in such an ultra-surrealist aesthetic. The tone is incredibly uneasy, which seems to mirror the nightmarishly foggy narrative. The film is presented in mostly black and white. The biggest thematic parallel that can probably be drawn is to David Lynch's films. The haunting vibes of Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet are probably the most comparable to what Dominik was trying to do with Blonde. While I remember only a few months before the release of Dominik's film, the excitement around Blonde was huge, with many outlets hyping the film up as perhaps the most anticipated film of 2022, alongside big names such as Batman and Maverick. Aside from the fact that Ana de Armas and Andrew Dominik were teaming up to make a Marilyn Monroe film, all the hype and the excitement that this film gained before its release was because of the fact that not only was Blonde set to be 3 hours long and released directly to Netflix, but also that it received an NC-17 rating. 4 months before the film's release, director Andrew Dominik warned audiences that the film will likely offend everybody, saying Blonde is a demanding film. If the audience doesn't like it, that's the audience's problem. It's not running for public office. The implication was that Blonde would be a graphic and explicit film in content, but also in subject matter. Perhaps the film-going public weren't entirely prepared for what the film was going to be. Expectations quickly went awry when Blonde premiered at Venice Film Festival, and the reception was not only mixed, but incredibly divisive. The film was described as controversial, offensive, and tasteless. Blonde may well be the definitive feel-bad biopic. Among the wide range of reception and mixed reactions Blonde received, it seemed that the one point of common agreement was praise for Ana de Armas' emotional performance of Marilyn Monroe, or perhaps more accurately, her portrayal of Norma Jean, gaining an Oscar nomination, praise from many outlets, even those of which overall negatively reviewed the film, and even a very enthusiastic endorsement from Colin Farrell.
And Anna, I thought you were extraordinary. I cried myself to sleep the night that I saw your film, Blonde. I cried myself to sleep, and something to do was the music as well that played at the moment where the shot opens and you just see her ankles at the edge of the bed. It messed me up so bad. Not a joke, but you're welcome to laugh.
A re-emerging theme in Blonde is identity. Her performance reflects not only the movie star, femme fatale character of Marilyn Monroe, but the isolation and real persona of Norma Jean.
She is pretty, I guess. But it isn't me, is it?
Putting the thematic and narrative elements aside for now, filmmaking-wise, Blonde is a beautifully shot and attentively assembled film. Cinematographer Chase Irvin achieved something truly remarkable with his work on Blonde, assisted by Andrew Dominik. Almost every frame of Blonde is visually marvelous and represents something thematically important. The changes in aspect ratio reflect the tonal shift throughout the journey of the film, with the sequences shot in 1.371 aspect ratio, delivering a captured and claustrophobic vibe, making scenes like Marilyn's opening audition that much more uncomfortable. While the anamorphic scenes shot in 2.391 aspect ratio have a widely more encapsulating feel to them. Less close-ups and more wide shots here, and a greater sense of environment in each scene and location for which these anamorphic shots are used for. To complement my point, here are some of my favorite shots from the film. Another point of unconventional presentation in Blonde is the sound mixing. Notice how quiet the vast majority of scenes are. Even in public places, you can barely hear anything other than the low-tempered delivery of dialogue.
I know what it's like to be lonely.
This is to further develop the isolation and loneliness that is explored throughout the film. Inspired and based mainly on Joyce Carol Oates' 2000 novel Blonde, the screenplay dives into many of the same controversies. As for the film, despite its brief time in the public sphere, Blonde has already managed to garner some pretty serious influences, including Travis Scott directed music video 7:12 p.m. from Future. But in terms of previous biopics from infamous celebrities, Blonde absolutely sets herself apart from the crowd, in not only style but structure. Instead of following the plateaued rise and fall story of the celebrity's career, Blonde focuses almost entirely on Norma Jean's personal struggles. The film opens on her mother attempting to drown her, entirely skips her rise, then follows Norma Jean as she tries to escape that of her childhood trauma into her late career. In many ways, Blonde can be considered a psychological horror film. For a film supposedly about the life of someone as glamorous as Marilyn Monroe, Blonde in a technical sense feels incredibly empty. Dominic uses framing very effectively to create the feeling of isolation that lingers throughout the film. The black and white, empty rooms, warped frames and effects and sequences, all of this used to depict the differences between Marilyn Monroe and Norma Jean, the struggle of identity.
You're thinking of Marilyn,
Yes.
her career.
Yes. And her well-being.
She doesn't have any well-being. She's only a career. They know I'm Norma, not Marilyn.
One of the many impressive elements of Ana de Armas' performance is its duality. Some of Blonde's subtext and themes can be interpreted in different ways. However, Ana de Armas' performance and the depiction of Marilyn Monroe here make it very obvious that Marilyn Monroe and Norma Jean are different people.
The film is about the meaning of Marilyn Monroe. What does she mean? How should we feel about her? What does she represent? And why is she like the American goddess of love of the 20th century?
If it isn't already clear enough from the unconventional and dreamlike presentation of the film, Blonde isn't trying to give a true or accurate depiction of the life of Marilyn Monroe. The film is instead entirely about identity and fame.
I know you're supposed to get used to it. But I just can't.
Expectations were high for the film months before its release, and while the voice of the loudly critical reviews, poor Rotten Tomatoes score, and moral and politically charged disapproval, Blonde still received a 14-minute standing ovation at its premiere in Venice, in which it's reported that Ana de Armas broke down in tears. And while the film was nominated for an Academy Award, it also won for Worst Picture at the Razzie Awards, given the wide range of opinions that Blonde has garnered. I think a fair question to ask is the negative reception accurate? Are Blonde's critics right? The criticism of Blonde seems to come primarily from the depiction of Marilyn Monroe as a person or subject, critics calling her character in the film shallow, baseless, and sexist. Some other major criticism thrown at Blonde was that the film felt disorganized, the pacing was poor, and some of the fabricated elements of the film were off-putting. While I won't defend every choice Andrew Dominik made with this controversial film, or pretend as if there isn't any validity to some of the detractors and criticism of Blonde, but I just can't shake the feeling that Blonde is a fundamentally misunderstood film.